Good evening and welcome to the regular or voting meeting of the Board of Education for June 18th, 2018. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Here.
Mrs. Burton?
Here.
Mr. Centers?
Here.
Mrs. Frank?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mrs. Bonnefield is here. President Johnson?
Here, we have a quorum. Mr. Centers, would you lead us in the pledge tonight?
Absolutely. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Again, thank you and welcome to all of those who are in the audience. If you'd like to follow along with our agenda tonight, you can go outside of the door to my left, and on the table you will find the agendas. And anyone wanting to address the board, there's blue slips out there as well. This is a voting meeting, so you won't hear the depth of discussion that you would normally hear during our committee of the whole meetings or our study sessions, and that's where we get into the nitty-gritty. And I would like to let the community know that we did have some technical difficulties with our last couple of meetings. On June 4th, if I get this right, we had video that night.
We were not on live.
We were not on live.
We
We're not on live, but we have it posted. On June 11th for our committee of the whole meeting, we were on live, but there's no video. So tonight, we're hoping to get it right.
Equipment.
There we go. Fred has told us we will be good tonight. So this is our voting meeting, and one of the things that we've been working on during this past year is respect. And one of our district climate goals, and I'll read it to you, says, all students will experience a positive, safe, and welcoming environment where both students and adults respect and value one another. This is something that, as a board, we take very seriously. And you will hear amongst the board and amongst cabinet, we respect each other. We may not always agree with one another, but we do it with respect. And one of the ways that we believe that we can best show our community, and particularly our students, is to act that out. So tonight you will see respect among the board. Anyone who addresses the board will be treated with respect, and we expect to be treated with respect as well. So we'll get right into it. We'll start with our communications. 3A, recognition of Mark Haig as MIAAA Athletic Director of the Year. Mrs. Jenkins.
Thank you. Good evening, President Johnson, members of the board, Superintendent Oquist. Tonight it is my pleasure to bring a very special recognition to the board. Churchill High School's athletic director, Mark Haig, was recently named the 2019 Michigan Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association's Athletic Director of the Year. That's a mouthful. For the entire state of Michigan. Join me in congratulating Mark Haig as he makes his way to the podium.
Before we do that, Mrs. Jenkins, we do need to have a motion. So could I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolution recognizing Churchill High School Athletic Director Mark Haig as the 2019 Michigan Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association's Athletic Director of the Year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers. Mrs. Jenkins.
Thank you. In honor of this designation, we have prepared a special resolution, and if I could invite Dan Willenborg to join us at the podium. Mr. Willenborg is the Director of Secondary Programs. Dan will read the resolution we've prepared into the record.
Thank you, and I just want to personally congratulate Mark. Mark and I go back to the mid-'90s when we were both at Churchill High School, and he impressed me then as a very passionate, very committed person, and someone who interjected daily energy and enthusiasm into his position as the athletic director. as I've worked with him in the administrative ranks. Certainly he's gained statewide recognition as the all-knowing, the sage of athletics. He has, in our meetings, he has kind of like the E.F. Hutton effect, where when he speaks, everybody stops and turns their head. Wait, that's Mark Haig. He has that kind of effect. But certainly, what an honor that his colleagues have recognized him with this award. And I have the privilege to read this resolution. Livonia Public Schools Board of Education, June 18th, 2018 resolution. Whereas the trustees of the Livonia Public Schools School District Board of Education are desirous of publicly recognizing excellence among employees of the school district, and whereas Mark Haig, Athletic Director at Churchill High School and member of the Michigan Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association, has been named the 2019 MIAAA Athletic Director of the Year for the state of Michigan, and whereas Mark is a 28-year employee of the Livonia Public Schools, first serving 6 years as a teacher, followed by 22 years as Athletic Director at Churchill High School, his alma mater, and whereas in achieving this honor, Mark has demonstrated outstanding leadership and dedication on the local and regional level of athletic administrators, and whereas this adds to the many accomplishments of Mark has achieved in his career, including being named Regional Athletic Director of the Year in 2002 and 2011, receiving the MIAAA National and State Level George Lovich Award of Merit, receiving the MIAAA Alan W. Bush Distinguished Service Award, and serving as President of the Western Lakes Athletic Association and the Kensington Lakes Athletic Association for 12 years. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the trustees of the Board of Education do hereby commend and congratulate Mark Haig on his outstanding accomplishments in high school athletics administration and thank him for the dedicated service he has rendered to interscholastic athletics locally, regionally, and across the state of Michigan. Signed, Tammy Bonifield, Secretary, Board of Education. Congratulations again. I'm sure you have a few words, but I did want to recognize Fred Price. You were probably going to say something about Fred, but Fred, thanks for bringing Mark aboard. It's great to see you again. It's great to see your son here as well. Mark, it's all yours.
It's Fred's fault. He hired me a long time ago. We can blame it on Fred. Thank you, everybody. I'll start with just a brief story. Rod Hosman was the principal who hired me years ago, and I had the benefit of knowing that Don Albertson, my predecessor, was going to retire the year before, so I worked with Don that whole year, studied with him, worked a lot of events for him. And then when the posting came up for athletic director, I applied for the job, and Rod Hosman came down several weeks later and came into the phys ed office at Churchill and said, "Congratulations, you're the new athletic director at Churchill High School." And I said, "Well, you haven't even interviewed me." And he said, "Well, you're the only person who applied." I kind of felt like, boy, was I that foolish or what? So, but anyway, I have to thank a number of people, and I was sitting with my daughter, Meredith, the other day, and one of her favorite movies growing up was Mean Girls. She loved that, and I've seen it probably 50 times. And to be with her, I would watch it 50 more. That's okay. But one of the things that, with apologies to Lindsay Lohan, who's the homecoming queen in that movie, she gives a piece of her award to a lot of different people because a lot of people allowed her to get to that position. So I kind of feel the same way, and I need to do that right now. So I'd like to thank first and foremost all the principals I've worked under, Rod Hosman, Joe Anderson, Keith McDonald, and my current principal, Kevin Etu, who have allowed me to do what I do and, given me kind of reign to, implement some programs at Churchill High School and throughout the state without any impedance. So I thank them very much. They've been very instrumental. The coaching staff at Churchill, which I feel is your lifeblood, it's everything, and it allows you to move forward with kids in your program, and that's one of the nice things that I get to do is to select that with help from some people, but that's a great resource for kids, so I love that I'm able to do that, and I thank them. Our parents, our CAP, our Boosters Club, Churchill Athletic Patrons is CAP, and all the people that we have that help me get through the programs that we do. It's a great little community. It's Middle Earth, I call it, Churchill, and I love it there, and they've been very helpful. Our administrative team who are here today, Mrs. Hunter, Mrs. Helvangus, Mr. Rivera, and Mr. Etu, have a great team there. We work very well together. They're very supportive of what I do. My cohorts at Stevenson and Franklin, Lori Heim and Ron Hammy, we work so well together, and they're a big part of what I do. So they've propped me up more times than not. So they're very much appreciated. So I thank them. The MHSAA and we call it the MIAAA. We don't get into the whole announcement of the name, so it's a mouthful. And Stacy did very well. Nice job there. So LPS. Central office, our board. I go back to Ken Watson, Randy Leap, Mrs. Oquist, and the board, and Mrs. Burton and Mr. Johnson, and all of you. We've been through some wars, all good. But,
On the same side, anyway.
It's been great. It's been great, and your support has been outstanding. And Mrs. Oquist, I think, is at more athletic events than I am. So that's just a cool thing that she's there and supports, and always with the hugest smile on her face, and always asking and inquiring, gets so involved, and I thank her for that, and I thank everybody here for all the support that they've given, and every time that they come by and see our program. I've always tried to just really instill fun in kids, at the varsity level, and even at the lower levels. Yes, it's important to win, it's important to be successful, but I always wanted kids to walk away with the fact that they had a fun, successful experience. You learned a few skills, but I wanted them to have a nice, positive experience and to come back the following year. So while winning is important, it's not everything in terms of what I've always tried, my philosophical approach. So I just wanted to make sure that kids were having a good time and a good experience, and I think we've done that at Churchill, so I'm pleased with that. A couple more people I need to thank. One of them is right here, my son, Joe, who's a Churchill grad himself, and my other son, Jake, who's in New York working right now, and my daughter, who's at her own soccer banquet. But many nights they were just lumps in the bed when I got home, and I missed a lot of what they did, but I got to as much as I could. And in fact, I got to see them participate at Churchill a lot. They were very instrumental in the kind of person I've become. So I thank them, my family, and my mom and dad in particular. And I'll leave you with this. My mom, growing up, I probably took a little bit more of a conservative approach to many of the different ventures and endeavors that I would get into. And my saying to my mom used to be, what if I fall? And she would look back at me and say, but what if you fly? So I was very appreciative of her support and how she's always been able to prop me up and say, let's go, let's give it a shot. My dad, and I would once in a while complain to him. His favorite saying was, I used to want new shoes till I saw the man with no feet. And he taught me perspective. He taught me how to keep things in perspective, and I take that with me to this day. So they've been extremely helpful in what I have done and what I have become. But it does take a village, and I'm just a small piece of that village. So I thank everybody. I thank all of you. I thank, as I said, my administrative team, our administrative team, my family, and thanks for letting me do this. I appreciate it, and as long as you'll have me, I'm going to be here. So thank you. Thanks.
All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers for the recognition of Mark Haig. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs.
Other questions or comments?
Good idea. Questions or comments?
Anybody else?
Mrs. Burton?
Congratulations.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Fantastic.
Yes.
The one thing that I would like to add is, in addition to the accolades that have already been very appropriately bestowed on Mr. Haig, Mark, you are one of the people who is a passionate advocate for kids. And when I think of you, that is one of the very first things that comes to my mind. If you have been fortunate to receive an email from Mark for any purpose, it always comes with a really thoughtful little quote at the very end, giving the appropriate credit for the quote, but I actually look forward to those. I look for those at the bottom of your quotes. But you are an advocate for kids. You are an advocate for when when teenagers can frequently be maligned, you are one who will stand up and say, maybe a couple, but most are really, really terrific kids. Not only do you advocate for kids at every level, you are an enormous champion for coaches. those in your building, in your program, and those even in other programs throughout our district or throughout our state. But a passionate advocate are the words that absolutely first and foremost come to my mind, and Livonia Public Schools is very, very, very blessed to have you. Thank you.
Mrs. Oquist.
If I may just add a couple comments, and I can't believe you literally took some of the same
Sorry.
words.
Yeah.
No. It is so emblematic of Mark. He really is a passionate advocate for athletes, but also for athletics and the role that it can play in the lives of our students. And not only in Churchill and within our district, but across our state. And I had the opportunity to see that as almost immediately in this role as we looked at the reorganization of our activity, of our league and our association. And one of the things that struck me is just what Dan said, which is people listen intently to the feedback that Mark gives. They know it's genuine, they know it's honest, they know it's well thought out, and he has the perspective of what is good for all. What is good for all children, what is good for all schools, what is good for the state of athletics in Michigan and in our region. So we are so fortunate. We do have amazing athletic administrators in this district. We have a long history of that, and it shows. It shows when our students are out at away games. It shows at our home games. We are always, always proud of our student athletes, of our coaches, of our schools, and of our programs. And Mark, you're a big reason for that. Congratulations on this well-deserved honor.
Any other questions or comments?
Could we have Mark's fan club stand? It's just wonderful to see so many folks here. Please stand if you're here for Mark. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. Even if you're not standing, we know you're still a part of the fan club, just to be clear. So thank you. It's a
Pay no
privilege to
attention
have
to
you.
the man behind the curtain. Okay, anything else? They stole all of my thunder, Mark. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mr. Centers, for recognition of Mark Hagan. Now, can you take the roll, Mrs. Bonnefield?
Yes, President Johnson. Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion passes. Thank you again, Mark.
Congratulations.
And now we know you have other things to attend to.
Yes, this is daughter's banquet. Enjoy.
Enjoy. Okay, that will take us to item 3B, gift to Franklin High School Food Pantry. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the generous monetary donations to the food pantry program at Franklin High School totaling $27,857.82.
Support. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. These generous donations were made by the following organizations and individuals: Livonia Kids and Families, Miles City Church, George and Eunice Begaris.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by, did I hear Mrs. Bradford?
Sure.
Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Jenkins.
Thank you, President Johnson. Maybe you've visited the food pantry at Franklin High School, or perhaps you've read the news coverage or stories on our website earlier this year. It's truly an amazing program and one that benefits LPS families in need while providing excellent job skills training for our Franklin Transition Program students. This program would not exist without the generous donations from our community, and tonight I am bringing financial donations for formal acceptance, as was read in the motion. But before we recognize our donors, I would like to offer some brief background on the food pantry program that was first established 4 years ago at Emerson Middle School. It was started by Emerson Principal Ann Owen with support from Livonia Kids and Families, a local nonprofit organization in response to a growing need for food assistance among local families. Before too long, a second pantry opened at Franklin High School in order to continue the assistance throughout the triad. Starting with this school year, we'll still call it this school year, the pantry solely operates out of Franklin and is actually a class for Livonia Transition Program students who have special needs. They help operate the pantry by completing numerous tasks that include everything from finding the best food prices to sorting and stocking the shelves. They also assist with the packing of the food boxes, getting them ready for families in need. The food pantry serves on average 40 families per month, district-wide, and served as many as 80 families during this past school year at one time. The goal is to provide assistance for up to 150 families. In order to make this happen, the food pantry receives generous donations of funds that are used to purchase food in bulk. As you have read in the motion, the donations have come from Livonia Kids and Families, Miles City Church, and from individual community members. At this time, I would like to ask Beth Santer, Student Services Coordinator, to join me at the podium so we can learn a bit more about how these donations have been used. Mrs. Santer?
Thank you, Superintendent Oquist, the Board of Education, Cabinet members, and the Livonia community. Thanks to Stacy for doing an amazing job for describing the origin of the food pantry and the importance it has for our work skills programs at Franklin High School. The gratitude we feel towards our donors can't be stressed enough. Without them, we wouldn't be able to provide pantry for our families or work skills for our students. It is so important for our students with moderate cognitive impairments to have authentic work skills over a sustained length of time. It drastically helps their employment options as they move on to their post-high school career. Someone once said that whatever we possess becomes of double value when we share it with others. Looking at the many donors who have made contributions to our food pantry, I know that to be true. I'm happy to recognize the amazing contributions of Livonia Kids and Families who have contributed money as well as taken in contributions from organizations such as Masco, Livonia Cares, Kiwanis, Livonia AM Rotary, Livonia Community Foundation, Bushes, and many others. This has drastically grown since we first started the pantry. More and more community members are donating to the pantry. It's so appreciated by us. I'm also happy to have Selena Begley here, who is a representative from Miles City Church, as well as a proud Livonia parent. Selena and Miles City Church have contributed to both our food pantry as well as our clothing depot, which is sponsored by the PTSA. The food pantry has been a beautiful complement to the clothing depot. That's not mentioned as much in the presentation tonight, but it's sponsored by the PTSA. It moved to Franklin this year, and both the clothing depot and the food pantry have complemented each other very nicely. We've also had additional donors that have been mentioned in the motion by George and Eunice Bajeras and some other community members. We thank all of them for being part of our school community and for supporting our motto, which is we benefit by benefiting others. At this time, I would love to have Selena come up and say a few words.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Just on behalf of Miles City, I'm so honored to be here for this. As Stacy and Beth have both mentioned, just the description of what the food pantry does for our families and our community just totally struck a string in our hearts when we came and met with Superintendent and many of you guys over on the staff member table. And we thought, how can we help this food pantry and clothing depot? So every Sunday we have our simple connect cards on chairs. We're a church, so this is a great way for people to connect with us and for us to connect with people, because that's what we want to do. We want to connect with people. And on the bottom of it, it says this card has value. The first time you fill out this card, we donate $5 to a local food pantry. So we are so thankful to be able to say, hey, when you fill this out, we give $5 on your behalf to a local food pantry. So we're just honored to be a part of it. As she said, I'm a proud parent. I have a son and a daughter both in the school and a future one on the way. And I just love what Livonia does for our families that are in need, and also the students that they can create these work skills to take them somewhere in life. So thank you for allowing us to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We prepared a certificate of appreciation for Miles City Church. It reads Livonia Public Schools Certificate of Appreciation, Miles City Church, for its financial contributions to Livonia Public Schools Food Pantry Program at Franklin High School, dated June 18, 2018, and signed by Mrs. Santer. Here you are. Thank you. We'll will be sure to get the certificate over to Livonia Kids and Families as well.
Okay, any questions or comments from the board? Just a resounding thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford, to accept the gift to Franklin High School Food Pantry. Mrs. Benefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Benefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. We're going to take, after the update from the superintendent, we're just going to take a couple of minutes. We'd like to come out and thank you personally. So we'll move on to item 3C, district update from the superintendent. Mrs.
Thank you so
Oquist.
much. And I'd just like to just take a moment to thank Mrs. Santer and all of our staff who are involved in the Franklin Food Pantry, the Emerson Food Pantry, and the extended work into the Clothing Depot, which, although organized by the PTSA, has really been adopted as a joint project. We are grateful for that, and we are so grateful for the community support. You are right, it did certainly jump, and I know Masco Corporation was a huge new donor this year. We're grateful for their immediate partnership with us as they join the community and the many, many other organizations that you mentioned. And when we met with Mile High City Church, their first question was, how can we help? What can we do? What do you need? And really, that was their focus, and that's what they've come through. So thank you, Beth, for all of your leadership on that. I would like to give a shout out to our LCTC students. They were recently involved in a game design competition. So these are primarily our graphics art students, media and game development. There were 16 finalists in the Games for Change competition hosted by General Motors Corporation. 12 of the 16 finalists in the entire region came from Livonia Public Schools, Livonia Career Technical Center. They came from Churchill, Franklin, Stevenson, as well as 2 of our schools with whom we have cooperative agreements, and students come to the Career Center for that program. The theme for the competition was Connected Cities, and students had to research a way to make the city of Detroit better by looking at economics and sustainability, transportation, autonomous vehicles, homelessness, the environment. They designed games that were really creative, they were ingenious, and they had an opportunity to show them off at a showcase this past weekend. And one of our students was the grand prize winner of the contest and won a $1,000 scholarship. So I would like to congratulate all of them and their teacher, Melinda Bush, for this great accomplishment. Congratulations to Charles McDougall. He is a graduate of Stevenson High School, and he recently received Boy Scouting's highest award of Eagle Scout. We have the opportunity on many occasions to celebrate that great accomplishment after many, many, many hours, days, weeks, and months of effort. For his Eagle Scout project, Charles coordinated and assisted scouts and volunteers in constructing 10 picnic benches for the Methodist Children's Home Outdoor Recreation and Counseling Center. So congratulations to Charles, a recent graduate. And while many of our students and many of our staff have concluded the year and embarked on summer recess as of today, we have many LPS staff both here at the central office complex and throughout the district who really are just getting geared up for the next 10 weeks. This is a busy time in our district, and each one of them contribute to getting our schools and our district ready for the new school year. On days especially like today, we know it is a challenge to be out there in the schools and to do all of that work in this heat and in the work that they do both outside and inside our facilities. But during these next 10 weeks, the district remains a relatively busy place, and we'd like to give a shout out to each of them for the work that they do. And we'd like to ask you to mark your calendars for the annual Bounce Back to School event. Yes, we've just ended school on Friday, and we'd like to remind you about coming back to school. I think all of the students have now turned off the program. On August 23rd from 5 to 8 p.m., we look forward to welcoming our families back at Riley Upper Elementary School for our annual Bounce Back to School event, which benefits our Livonia Public Schools Education Foundation. So mark your calendars. We'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you, President Johnson.
And at this point, we'll take a very short break, and we will be back shortly. Thank you. We are back, and we'll move on with our agenda. We'll move to item 3D, written communications. Are there any written communications? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3E, audience communications. Audience communications is a time when the audience has an opportunity to address the board. It's not a question and answer period. The board will listen to any comments from the community. Just to give some background, the board has three responsibilities. The first is to hire and evaluate the superintendent. Second is to set district policy, and the third is to set the long-term financial goals for the district. If the comments and audience communication relate to those three areas, you can expect a response from the board. Other issues, just about anything else, are day-to-day, and they would be handled by Mrs. Oquist or the cabinet. So if your issue relates to something along those lines, then you would expect a response from Mrs. Oquist or the board, or I'm sorry, from the cabinet. With audience communication, each speaker is allotted 3 minutes. This allows each speaker enough time to speak whatever they have to say, and it allows others an opportunity to speak as well. We found that through the timing, Mrs. Bonifield will be our timer. I used to do it. And she has on her phone, and there will be a audible tone. We found that is a little more appropriate than just trying to knock somebody down from speaking and telling them your 3 minutes is up. So I have 2 blue slips. The first is Lisa, is it Braybeck?
Yes, it is.
Good evening.
I'm supposed to give you my address as well, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so my address is 47846 Cheltenham Drive, Novi, Michigan. My daughter Allison Braybeck was a student at Garfield, and she's 20 years old. I started with one idea of coming here for, and now I've kind of changed it just through the course of listening to everybody. Really, when it comes to procedures and policies, it's really important when it comes to the disabled to have some real firm foundation there, because they are vulnerable and they're dependent on those around them. I bet you didn't know, which I didn't know, that Adult Protective Services does not investigate schools. I didn't know that until we were involved with Adult Protective Services, and there were a lot of red flags pointing at her school. But they don't investigate schools, they don't investigate red flags. Did you know that though my daughter's situation was referred to the Novi Police because it was filed as an assault, and Novi Police can close the case and believe it happened at her school? But a belief doesn't generate anything. My daughter is not a great witness. It goes nowhere. It dies. If I wasn't standing here with you today, you'd have no idea that this even was a possible situation. But why I'm here is because if the principal of that school had taken the time to pick up a phone and ask me some questions, he would have had some serious red flags for himself by his staff reporting things that turned out not to be true. And then he would have been able to take action as the administrator as to how he wanted to proceed. But because he didn't take the time to ask those questions, whoever those folks are that ultimately had a play or a hand in that situation that I'm talking about, they're still there. So as a mother, I can't send my daughter back to that school, right? I have Adult Protective Services telling me, there's a lot of red flags there, ma'am. I wouldn't send my daughter back there either. But if I wasn't standing here today, you'd never know. I never knew. I'm blown away still that you can have Adult Protective Services investigate a situation and say, it happened at the school. And you can have the police, Novi Police investigate it, say, we believe it happened at the school. But that's it. Closed case. Now, my daughter's fine. She's out of the school. But there's other children there. There's other students there. There's other people there. As a mom, how could I possibly not want to make sure that something changes so that someone else doesn't have that happen? How can I not? So I'm not here raising 9 kinds of heck. I'm not trying to crucify anyone. I'm not suing. I'm not doing anything. I just need you to look into this because you have to understand, if your principal had called me and asked, when did you see those bruises, Mrs. Braybuck, that you emailed me about, I would have told him, well, they were there Wednesday and they were there Thursday. So he could have gone back and went, wait a minute, my parapro just came in and said, those bruises weren't there Thursday. So they had to happen at home. He would have known immediately there was a red flag. If he had taken the time, My daughter had to go to the bathroom 2 more times. If he had 4 more staff members take my daughter in the bathroom and confirm what the parapro said, as far as my daughter being able to answer the question of where that happened, then he would have been able to determine, there's something fishy here, especially if you talk to the teacher. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Brayback. The other blue slip I have is from Lynn O'Neill. Ms. O'Neill.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Do you need my address?
We have it on the blue slip.
Okay. I'm a former teacher from Livonia, and I am here to just give the opportunity for all of you to join us tomorrow evening at the Livonia Public Library. Dr. Randy Leopa is giving a presentation on public school finance, and it's entitled Funding Michigan Schools So Students Meet Standards and Achievement, a New Study. It is tomorrow at the auditorium in the Livonia Civic Center Library at 7 p.m. And I just wanted to make you and the public aware that this is happening, and we'd love to have everyone come because it's a very serious topic, and I know that we're all concerned about it. That's it. I have a flyer if anybody wants the flyer.
If you just want to give it to Mrs. Oquist.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
You're
Thank
right,
you for
Liz.
being here.
An important topic. We'd love to see folks
Yeah.
come out for that.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Those are the only 2 blue slips I have. I don't see anyone else approaching. So we will move on to item 3F, response to prior audience communication. Is there any response to prior communication? Seeing none, that will take us to item 4, consent agenda. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the following consent agenda items as recommended by the superintendent. 5A, minutes of the public hearing of June 4th, 2018. 5B, minutes of the special meeting of June 4th, 2018. 5C, minutes of the closed session of June 4th, 2018. 5D, minutes of the regular meeting of June 4th, 2018. 6A, approval to renew MHSAA membership for 2018-2019. Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Frank. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you. Would you all pass down your minutes of the closed session, please? That will now move us to item 6B, approval to purchase algebra textbooks. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District purchase the textbook Envision Algebra 2, 2018, for secondary Algebra 2 courses from Pearson Education Incorporated at a total cost of $124,900.66. Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. O'Brien, are you going to bring us up to date on this?
Sure. Thank you, President Johnson. We are bringing the recommendation for the purchase of the Envision Algebra 2 textbook. Our district has specific recommendations for textbook adoptions, and this committee consisted of 3 high school teachers, 1 from each of our high schools. They spent extensive time reviewing our current Michigan State standards and the Common Core shifts for teaching mathematics. This book best met the evaluation criteria and coherently developed the mathematical concepts they deemed as priorities during the analysis. This series, we currently have the Algebra 1 and the Geometry textbook by Envision, provides engaging tasks to deepen conceptual understanding, as well as opportunities for students to strengthen and apply procedural skills. Teachers shared the text with students and had them complete a survey relating to their perceptions of how the text built on the math concepts that they were covering during the pilot, and then their overall opinions of the textbooks. These textbooks have been reviewed by the department chairs and by the secondary principals. The total cost for Envision is $124,900.66, and these funds would come from the secondary textbook budget, which has been generously supported by the Wayne County Enhancement Millage.
Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Just following up on your comment, thank you to our community for supporting the Wayne County Enhancement Millage. It is money that was supported county-wide, but we are trying to use that where we will get the biggest bang for our buck and the longest-lasting reach for these dollars. So this is something that we definitely needed, and we thank our community very much for supporting it.
Yes, I agree.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you as well to Mr. Hillard and the committee. We know that they put in a lot of time in reviewing textbooks, and it's greatly appreciated. I'm sure the community and our students are very grateful to what they do. Okay. So we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval to purchase Algebra 2 textbooks. Would you take the roll, Mrs. Bonnefield?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That'll take us to item 7, business matters. Item A, approval of roofing design and construction services firm. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson?
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve the recommendation of the owner's representative, Plant Moran Cressa, to award the contract for roofing design work and construction administration services on the summer 2019 roof replacement at Johnson Elementary to Roofing Technology Associates, RTA, Livonia, Michigan, for a total cost of $48,000, and authorize the superintendent or her designee to negotiate and execute final contract.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton. And Mr. Francis, you're going to be addressing this for us?
Yes, sir. The Roofing Technologies Associates are the roofing designers and our construction representatives during the current phase, which is really our first phase currently going on with our roofs. We're currently working with a piece of Franklin High School. We're doing a full roof replacement at Holmes Middle School, and we have 2 smaller projects here at the central office complex. Having had a relationship with RTA, who also earlier in the year was on every one of this district's roofs doing an assessment for the district, we have been very comfortable and pleased with their work, their design work, their follow-through and follow-up. So we are recommending them to re-engage, to design, and be the construction representative again for the planned summer 2019 project, which will be Johnson Upper Elementary, very similarly to what we have occurring currently at Holmes Middle School, be a full roof replace with a fascia panel replacement as well. So the fees, which are very competitive, and they have kept the same at 2.8%, which is a very competitive rate. For that project, the Johnson design is coming to $48,000. It's actually been rounded down slightly to get to $48,000. So we do recommend the board's approval for this design work with RTA.
Thank you, Mr. Francis.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments from the board? We had quite a bit of discussion at the committee of the whole. So.
We did.
All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Burton, for approval of a roofing design and construction services firm. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That will take us to item 7B, approval to purchase generator. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Frank.
move that the Board of Education of Livonia Public Schools School District approve the purchase of a 100-kilowatt diesel generator for for the Administration Complex from Cummins Sales and Service, New Hudson, Michigan, in the amount of $34,691.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers. And Mr. Francis is going to help us with this.
Yes, sir. We are proposing a purchase of a 100 kilowatt generator, which will be used upon delivery. It's a diesel generator that we will hook in our information technology data center that will be serving as a backup for the data center, and it will have the items such as the servers, the air conditioners, the UPS, which we spoke about at our committee meeting last week, which is actually a battery that feeds into the servers. You never want your servers to be down even for a split second. So the way that the head-end room works for us is that the generator and even DTE power flow through the UPS, which again is a giant battery. And therefore, if we have an interruption in DTE service, the generator, while it takes a moment to kick in, our servers still remain running through the UPS. So we currently also have a 60 kilowatt generator that we found is not quite strong enough to power the data center without some fluctuations. It could keep it running, but we get a little bit of dirty power from it and we fluctuate. So to be safe and more appropriate, we would like to purchase the 100 kilowatt generator and run the backup to the head-end room using that, and still continue using the 60 kilowatt generator to be backup for this building with regard to things like electrical outlets, some emergency lighting, boilers to run the hot water through the pipes, etc. So we are looking to purchase for the $34,691. Cummins Sales and Service has been helpful in coming out and working with the district's maintenance department to size it appropriately. We actually did a load test for a week here at the building to ensure that the 100 kW is an appropriate size for what we're trying to accomplish, and it is, and our electricians and maintenance department worked in tandem with them. So this is from the NJPA cooperative agreement, so that has satisfied the district's requirement for bid process because it's through the cooperative agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Francis.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments from the board?
Oh, this is a sinking fund. Apologies. This is also from the sinking fund as a purchase.
Mrs. Burton?
That was all I was just.
Okay. And Mr. Francis, we're going to have two generators then, correct?
We will have two generators. Again, one will be dedicated to the data center, or also known as the head-end room, and the smaller, the 60 kW that we currently use, will be dedicated to other portions of the building.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mr. Centers, for the approval to purchase a generator. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That'll take us to item 8, personnel matters, and A is leave of absence. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the superintendent and approve the request for a leave of absence as listed below. Mary K. Hussey, 2018-2019 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. Is that going to be Mr. Archibald?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening. This is actually an extended, second-year extension of the leave. This leave request is in accordance with the LEA collective bargaining agreement. The HR department has reviewed the circumstances and recommends approval.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion to accept the leave of absence by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That'll take us to item 8B, retirements. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolutions of appreciation for the services rendered by Mitzi Castelli, Judith Gordon, Kathleen Hedden, Denise Kimball, John Moore, Wayne Roberts, and Lori Van Artsen.
Support.
We have motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mr. Archibald.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. These 7 individuals leave with a total of 167 years of experience and amazing service to the district for an average of 23.8 years per person. Again, tonight we bring the names of these 7 individuals who are retiring. I'd like to thank these individuals for their years of dedicated service to the students and to the district, to our school community, and ask that the board adopt these resolutions of appreciation in their honor.
Thank you, Mr. Archibald. Questions or comments from the board? Mr. Centers.
I just want to point out Wayne Roberts, who stands out after 38 years. And someone that we've encountered so many times, I think, as well, through our travels throughout the district. So congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion to accept the resolutions of appreciations for employees who are retiring by Mrs. Burton, supported by Ms. Bradford. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That'll take us to item 8C, approval of letter of understanding with LPA. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education enter into a letter of understanding with the Livonia Paraprofessionals Association, whose agreement has been approved by LPA leadership. Said agreement is in reference to the establishment of GSRP associate teachers and classroom assistants into the association.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, President Johnson. Throughout this school year, we have been negotiating with leadership from the LPA, Livonia Paraprofessionals Association, for the terms and conditions for the GSRP, which is the Great Start Readiness Program, classroom assistants, and associate teachers. We have come to an agreement with the LPA, and we are recommending to the Board of Education to approve this letter of understanding, insofar as it represents a fair agreement and one that is consistent with the guidelines of the Board of Education.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Jarvis, for the approval of letter of understanding between Livonia Public Schools School District and Livonia Paraprofessionals Association. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. Thank you.
President Johnson?
Yes.
I'd just like to thank Mr. McDonald, Dr. Terriel, and Mrs. Rogowski, in addition to the LPA leadership and their representatives for their work in coming to this agreement.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. That will take us to item 9, hearing from board members. And item A is second reading of Board Policy DA, Goals and Objectives. May I have a motion, please?
Mr. President Johnson,
Mrs. Jarvis.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy DA, Goals and Objectives.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Burton. And I believe Mrs. Smith is going to be helping us with that.
Thank you very much. Just to summarize, in this board policy, it states that the Board of Education shall meet with the superintendent prior to the start of the fiscal year to determine the goals and objectives of the school system. These goals and objectives shall be factors in the development of the budget. So very minor details, wording recommended for change in this policy. And as the board may recall, we brought this for our first reading to our board meeting on June 4th.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments? No? Seeing none, pretty simple change. We have a motion by Mrs. Jarvis, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the second reading and adoption of Board Policy DA Goals and Objectives. Would you take the roll, Mrs. Bonnefield?
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 9B, and we do have 6 second readings tonight, so we'll get through these. This is the second reading and adoption of Board Policy DB, Budget Goals and Objectives, formerly DCA. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bonnefield.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy DB, Budget Goals and Objectives, formerly DCA.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford. And once again, we'll turn to Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson. Just a reminder, this policy pertains to the budget of the school district and states that it shall provide information on the educational activities of the district, ensure the continuance of those activities for the budgeted period, communicate the prioritization of resources, serve as a means of financial control, and provide the administration with the authority to make expenditures within their approved budget. In this policy, we didn't change the intent of the policy, but it was a matter of updating some of the wording to make sure that it was understandable by anyone that read it. This policy, too, was brought for a first reading at our June 4th regular meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion for the second reading and adoption of Board Policy DB, Budget Goals and Objectives, formerly DCA. It was brought by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mrs. Burton.
Yes.
Mr. Centers.
Yes.
Mrs. Frank.
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis.
Yes.
And President Johnson.
Yes, motion carries. That will take us to item 9C, second reading and adoption of Board Policy DC, Budget Preparation and Adoption, formerly DCC. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Burton.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy DC, Budget Preparation and Adoption, formerly DCC.
Support.
I think I heard Mrs. Frank. We have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank. And once again, Mrs. Smith, you're going to get tired.
I am. I'm ready. This board policy states that the tentative or proposed budget shall include all the anticipated revenues and expenditures for the coming school year and shall be designed in the format outlined in the state's accounting manual and in accordance with the state school accounting codes. And again, same with this policy, not a major change as far as the intent, but just some updating wording so that we all know what the intent is. This board policy, too, was brought to the board for a first reading on the June 4th regular meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Just so the public is aware, the board is very aware of this because we've been through it, as President Johnson stated, at the study session and again at our committee of the whole in depth. But this is the combination of 3 policies, all that were related to the adoption of the budget. It used to be just the adoption of the budget, and then the next policy was going to be public review of that budget. The following policy would be the final adoption of the budget. So we're going to be taking out a couple of policies, but they're not being just deleted. They're all being combined into this one, so that this one policy on budget preparation and adoption reads in all 3 of its stages, rather than 3 separate policies to cover it. But just so the public's aware, we are not eliminating any steps of our budget. We are simply combining them into one policy for an easier, more logical read.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Any other questions? Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mrs. Smith, are we changing the accounting codes that we're using?
We are not. We've always been compliant with the state's accounting codes, and we will continue to be compliant with the state's accounting codes. The verbiage in the board policy read that the state code classification, that's just updating the verbiage. That's a term no longer used. Instead, we refer to that as accounting codes. So that was a
Okay.
matter of updating the language.
In the legal reference that's in the policy, could you elaborate on that?
Yep, the state law outlines the format in which the budget needs to be done. It also speaks to when the budget needs to be presented to the board and adopted. And so this policy is outlining those laws that the board and the district follow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Burton, supported by Mrs. Frank, to adopt the second reading and adoption of Board Policy DC, Budget Preparation and Adoption, formerly DCC. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Sorry. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 9D, second reading of Board Policy DCDA, Budget Publications, Public Review, and this is a removal of policy. Mrs. Smith?
Yes.
President Johnson.
I did not.
Yep.
May I have a motion?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Frank?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and remove Board Policy DCDA, Budget Publications Public Review, which has been incorporated into Board Policy DC, Budget Preparation and Adoption.
Support.
Now we have a motion by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford. I thought I'd just give Mrs. Smith a little breather. Okay, Mrs. Smith.
Thank you, President Johnson. As Vice President Burton stated, we aren't removing language from board policy, nor are we making a change to our budget preparation process. Instead, we included this in policy DC, so it's moving this language to policy DC. Therefore, we're able to remove this policy DCDA. But again, no change to our process, and again, no removal of the language, simply moving the language over to the policy DC.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion for second reading and adoption of Board Policy DCDA, Budget Publications Public Review, by Mrs. Frank, supported by Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. We only have two more. That'll take us to item 9E, second reading of Board Policy DCE, final adoption of budget. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mr. Centers?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and remove Board Policy DCE, final adoption of budget, which has been incorporated into Board Policy DC, budget preparation and adoption.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Burton. Mrs. Smith?
Thank you, President Johnson. This, too, is a policy that we are not removing the language, nor are we changing our process. We'll continue to bring a final budget recommendation to the board for approval and also make copies available to the public, both on our website and our offices. So this is simply moving the language from this separate policy and incorporating into policy DC.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Burton, for the second reading and adoption of Board Policy DCE, final adoption of budget. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. That takes us to item 9F, second reading of Board Policy DD, Line Item Transfer Authority. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson,
Mrs. Bradford.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District accept the recommendation of the Policy Committee and adopt board policy language per the attached document for Board Policy DD, Line Item Transfer Authority, formerly DCI.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers. And Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. This last policy, the Line Item Transfer Authority, outlines that the district has the authority to make expenditures within the approved budget adopted by the board. And it also clarifies that we hold all employees that have responsibility over a budget code responsible for keeping their expenditures within the approved budget amount. The original policy said, referred to department heads, and this is to be more inclusive, that we have more than just department heads that are responsible for budget line items and that we hold them all accountable. The policy also gives the district administration the authority to transfer money between budget lines up to $50,000 prior to board approval in emergency situations. This policy was brought to the board for our first reading on June 4th.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Any questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Bonnefield.
Mrs. Smith, in the case that we do have an urgent situation and it is under the $50,000, does that then just pass by the board? How do we know that that is actually happening?
Yep, we have another board policy, and it's in the administrative procedures that outlines the different purchases that warrant board approval. So currently, we bring any purchases over $23,000 to the board. So regardless of when that happens, that always would take place before we make a purchase. And we, in that policy, also states that purchases between $10,000 and $23,000 would happen after the receipt of 3 written quotes. And that's to say that these are all within the approved budget. So we don't have the authority to make an expenditure if it hasn't been pre-approved by the board in the board budget adoption. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mrs. Bonnefield. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mr. Centers, for second reading and adoption of Board Policy DD, Line Item Transfer Authority. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford.
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes, motion carries. And just so the community is aware, you see that we had 6 policy changes tonight. This is an ongoing process. As I indicated earlier, one of the main objectives, main obligations of the board is to set policy. And we're fortunate to have the kind of cabinet and staff that we have that constantly keeps an eye on changes. Things don't always stay the same. This isn't a static environment. It's very dynamic. And on occasion, we need to correct and change policies, and we appreciate all the work that cabinet and staff put in to bring these changes to us. So much appreciated. Thank you. That will bring us to item 9G, hearing from board members. And anyone who watches regularly has noticed that over time, we sort of modify as we go along how we handle hearing from board members. And we found that once we started doing hearing from the superintendent, she tended to be very comprehensive because she's omnipresent throughout the district, which makes it sometimes a little difficult for the board to add anything to that. But we do that at this point, and I will open it up to the board for any comments you may have. Mrs. Burton.
Yes, along the lines of, I give a hearty amen to your comments about policy and thanking our cabinet. I'd like to thank Mrs. Smith specifically. She and I sat down and went over a lot of policy, but it's very important that our policy not only be understandable to the board and to our cabinet and our employees, but it's also very important that it be understandable to the general public. But thank you very much, Allison. I really appreciate the extensive work that you have done on the policies that were brought forth tonight. It's very appreciated. I also want to give a very big thanks to Tammy Bonnefield and our former board member Diane Laura, who also did extensive work on policies for really over the entire policy book. And we can't change everything all at once, and literally it's taken quite a length of time, and we are still finishing up some of the things that needed to be tweaked. But that was a very, very substantial amount of work, and it's very appreciated.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. I just wanted to extend best wishes and good luck to our Livonia robotics teams, the Warriors and the Tyros, as they go for their first post-season competition this weekend. It'll be in Taylor at the Big Bang event, and we hope that they are very successful. I'd also like to welcome some of the students who've applied to be on the team next year. I understand there were 120 applicants. Wow. Which is amazing. I'd love to see that program growing.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Frank?
And I just wanted to wrap up, and Superintendent Oquist said it earlier, but as the school finished up this calendar year on Friday, it was beautiful to see all the clap-outs that they did at the different schools and the way that our staff finished so strong and finished well. So I just wanted to thank our teachers, our staff, everyone for a fantastic school year and all the hard work that they did. It's so inspiring to see these kids crying because they're leaving their teachers and they're leaving their schools in fourth grade, going to the fifth grade. It's so neat, the connection they have with our professional teachers and with our staff, and it's amazing to see their growth over time. So thank you for a fantastic year and for finishing well.
Thank you, Mrs. Frank. Mr. Centers.
I would like to compliment our communications team, Stacy and Katie Patterson, who did a very nice job with the Passport to Safety event. We're part of the committee along with several other groups, but really lots to do for the families. I think it grows every year and really educational for the students, and it's just a great event. So it looks like our district folks put in a a lot of work, so compliments to them.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. Mrs. Bradford.
I'd like to echo Crystal Frank's comments. I hope all our teaching staff, students, and families have a safe and happy summer and enjoy. And thank you for all of our staff and all that they do on a daily basis. I'm sure they're going to enjoy their summer thoroughly, but get ready for the fall. We'll be back shortly. But I hope you have a great summer.
Thank you, Governor.
Sorry, somebody has to be.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Other questions or comments? I just wanted to remind the committee that the board will not have a meeting until July 23rd. Doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a lot going on. The staff and cabinet still work during that period of time, but we will take a little bit of a break. Mrs. Burton mentioned Mrs. Bonifield on the policy, but I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Mrs. Burton because she is our policy geek.
Yes.
I really haven't seen anyone who gets into reading and digesting policies the way you do. And I think that that's a great service to the board because I'm not sure the rest of us could do that.
We
So
appreciate it.
greatly appreciated for everything you do on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, everybody have a safe summer, and we are adjourned.